he of Sunlight soap, and other products, purchased virtually the whole of the 250,000 hectares of Lewis and Harris in the Western Isles. And in 1923, just over 100 years ago, after several years of failed attempts to introduce modern industrial development in those islands, he decided to sell the whole thing. But as part of this disposal, he gifted the Stornoway estate, about 28,000 hectares, to the local community. So began the community land story in Scotland. The Stornoway Trust, owned in that local community, still own and run that estate. So to recognise this historical event, and many of which followed later in the century and into the next, Community Land Scotland launched the 100 Years of Community Ownership project. And this aimed to create a living archive of community ownership, to inspire would-be communities to start their own journey, and to undertake a series of events, or to acknowledge, celebrate, and share the achievements of these communities, which have become involved in this pioneering aspect of land reform. So this event is one of these. Simon Fraser was a solicitor based in Stornoway and Lewis, and he played a leading and vital role in advising communities who were striving to acquire and manage land and property in Scotland. He had a deep interest in land reform, community empowerment, and the cultural importance of land. And from the early 1990s, in a quiet, modest, but decisively professional way, he helped communities to navigate through the legal and financial complexities of land purchase. His legacy was the success of community buyouts in places like Assynt, Northwest Sutherland, in Knoydart, which we'll hear about in a second, in North and West Harris, Dawson in Lewis, the islands of Gigha, Egg, and South Uist. His contribution inspired many other communities to take control of their land, and also inspired governments to introduce land reform legislation in Scotland and funding. Now, to recognise the significant and invaluable contribution that Simon made, a series of events in his name was built into the Highland Years of Community Ownership. So, I'm delighted to welcome you to this event. Falsha, Croeso, welcome. This special event is the first south of the border. We've had 3 of these previously, and a collaboration between Community Land Scotland, the Community Land Trust Network, Compass, and Power to Change. And our aim of this event is to share experience and learning from different parts of the UK about community ownership and the transformation that it can deliver. And the timing is good because the English Devolution Bill is examining proposals for community rights to buy. The Welsh Government is reviewing community asset transfer and other community ownership initiatives, and the Scottish Government is reviewing the existing community rights to buy in Scotland and introducing new policies and new initiatives in its current draft land reform bill, currently going through Parliament. Well, you've probably gathered very quickly that this is not a conventional lecture. You'll be glad to hear, because I'm going to stop in a minute. It's a series of small presentations and discussions amongst the people behind me, and I'll introduce those in a moment. We'll have a facilitated discussion about the issues that they bring out. We'll open it to the floor to a question and answer. Not just the people here, but those people online are encouraged to use the chat facility to ask questions as well. And we're going to finish with a musical contribution to acknowledge actually the cultural importance of land and land ownership in the UK. So this will equip us, I hope, with a much richer understanding of the path to community power through the ownership of land and property. And so to our panel of distinguished and experienced activists, who are going to share some thoughts and ideas with us. And I'll introduce them all at once, and then they can speak separately. Angela Williams is the development manager at the Taras Valley Nature Reserve and Estate in Dumfries and Galloway. She was at pains to tell me because I thought it was in the Scottish borders, but it's in Dumfries and Galloway.
Good start.
Good start, yes. It's very close to the Scottish borders. In fact, it borders the borders.
It does indeed. It does indeed.
But yeah, she's got a role there in developing projects that generate income as well as contributing to the overall aims of the reserves. Now, Angela has 20 years experience with community buyouts, including, as I mentioned earlier, the Neudart estate, managing projects, very diverse projects such as affordable housing, deer management, bunkhouse development, ranger service, and an off-grid hydroelectric scheme. In contrast, Sonia Bassi is from Liverpool. She's a trustee of the Community Land Trust Network, but also the current chair of the Liverpool Charity and Voluntary Services and Mandela 8, and a director of the L8 Matters Community Land Trust. I could talk a lot about the other things that Sonia does, but she's got a very diverse and extensive CV. She's got extensive community work and community engagement, arts regeneration, social housing, particularly in the BME communities in Liverpool. Casey Edwards is the community-led housing project manager in Compass in Wales, a development agency working for positive and economic change, now supporting over 50 community groups with a pipeline of over 300 affordable community-led homes. Casey's worked in the third sector for over 10 years, from small local charities involved in community assets transfers to working for one of Wales' largest housing associations. And finally, Nick Plum. Nick is a Director of Policy and Insight at Power to Change. I think do tank back in community business. He oversees the organisation's policy, research and communications functions, covering everything from devolution and high street regeneration to local government procurement and community cohesion. So this is our panel. As you can hear, wide range of experience, urban, rural, Wales, England, Scotland. So I would ask, there's one other guest I will introduce separately at the end, Chris Ellis, who will provide us with the musical element in the evening. But Angela, can I ask you to take the floor, thanks.
Thanks very much, John. And thank you for the introduction, and it's great to be here tonight. And to everybody online, it's great to have you all along. It's quite scary to hear that I've actually been working in the community land movement for just a year short of 25 years. So I feel that's far too long in many ways, but every day feels like a different story, a different challenge comes up. Working in the community land sector certainly keeps you active, and you have to be very fleet of foot. I've worked for a number of different landowners. The two most significant are Neudart and Langham, and they're the ones I'm going to refer to. But every community landowner has a different reason for land ownership. Neudart, which is up on the west coast of Scotland, just north of Mallaig, on the mainland, but you can only access it by boat. Bought 12,000 acres of land back in 1999. Owning the land, and I'd like to say assets, but actually at the time, to be honest, there were more liabilities, was more actually about desperation. Moving fast forwarding 20 years to Langham, 2019, the purchase of 10,500 acres and the assets with that was very much about aspiration. And this is just reflecting the circumstances at that time. Back in 99, Neudart was a community of 60 people. Ownership was very much about security. The community at that point had probably 10, 15 years of a succession of absentee landowners. For some bizarre reason, most of the landowners had a connection with Sheffield United Football Club, I think it was Sheffield United, and Noida sort of got kind of passed on to the next director. So I think it's fair to say that probably a lot of the owners maybe didn't take the responsibilities of land ownership seriously. The last owner, when he was being sentenced to go to jail, the judge did say he was a man unfit to run a business. So that was quite an impressive backdrop for the community to say enough is enough and to tackle the obstacles in their way, not least Bank of Scotland, politicians, to actually make ownership take place. And this was about security. It was about security of homes, security for work, security for services, water, power, everything that most people take for granted, all community owned, community managed. Fast forward to 2025, and there is now, and has been for a while, an absolute thriving community. Population has doubled, 130 plus people. I tried to count up because I'm obviously not there now, but I do have a lot of contacts with it, and it's either 8 or 9 community companies. So that's 8 or 9 sets of boards, sets of trustees. We've got charities, we've got KICs, we've got Community Benefit Society, SCIOs. The activity and the enthusiasm that takes place is absolutely phenomenal. If anybody's been lucky enough to visit, you will appreciate how active and how dedicated individuals are to making that community work. For Langham, 20 years after Noida, ownership was very much in response to change, and maybe a little bit about fear of change as well. Unlike Noida, Langham had had a landowner, a very, very stable landowner for 200 plus years. However, they were changing their business model and starting to sell off land holdings. I think it's fair to say the local community really didn't think that the land was ever going to be sold. It had always been owned by the Clew. It wasn't going to be sold. And actually, they felt very much it was their land. Culturally, there is every year the common riding is held where the A7 is closed, the town is bombarded by several thousand people, many of them on horseback, and the common land is marked. It is ridden and marked. This cultural activity goes back over 200 years following disputes with the landowner with regard to rights on the land. And I think the fear that could a new landowner change that was an absolute driving force. And the Langham Initiative, a development trust of many years standing, became the focus for driving forward the purchase. I think if you'd asked anybody in the community about buying the land, owning the land before this, nobody would have been interested. There was no right to buy put in because the Clew would own it. It was always ours. We can always make of it what we want. So fast forward 6 months, £6 million raised to buy 10,500 acres, a farm, various properties, housing. The driver was about regeneration of a town, and it was sold as this was going to be developed as a nature reserve, and a nature reserve that would draw people in. So it isn't just about nature, it isn't just about climate. Fundamentally, it is about people and sustainability of the reserve and contributing to the sustainability of the town. So lots of people ask who aren't familiar with community land ownership, well, what does it deliver? They see the headlines, and certainly in Langham's case, they think we're absolutely really, really rich because we raised £6 million. Unfortunately, that £6 million didn't even touch some of it touched our bank account, but it's mainly, all in the Clews. Community ownership will deliver differently in every location, but it really does matter, because the ownership, whether it's a land or an asset, gives power and control to that community. And that power and control is invested back in the local community so it can respond to what the local needs of that community are. That might be something as simple as developing a local lettings allocations policy for affordable housing, making sure that it can target whether or not it's a profession or a particular need in the community at that point. So you can actually use that asset, not just to support in housing case the individuals who are living in it, but supporting that wider community. In Langham, when we revisited our business plan, this is now post-COVID and post-Ukraine, the role of the farm, the role of community growing, from not being mentioned, was suddenly very, very high up the agenda. So you now have the scope for what you are seeing as the drivers from the local community as to how they want that land to be used. But let's not pretend any of this is easy. There are many challenges, and anybody involved in any kind of community asset activity will know that. Obviously, finance and investments are always going to be an issue, but probably more than that is the people side, how you maintain community support, working for the organisation, how you cope with criticism and negativity, because every community will have people who think it's wonderful, but equally people who are really unhappy with the concept. And you need to be prepared for the time it's going to take. It's a marathon, it's not a sprint. And accepting that and trying to get the community to accept that it needs to take time to know the land, to know the assets, to know the potential, is quite difficult at times. And respecting, that there's fear of change, that community ownership can sometimes be a threat to people. We've been lucky in Scotland with the support from the Scottish Government, but organisations like Community Land Scotland as well, because owning the land does matter. It's not just what you do with it, as a private landowner will say. So if I had any advice, I would say, no, it's not easy. It can be frustrating, but ultimately it can be the most rewarding experience going as well.
Thanks. Very much. One of the tough jobs of this is cutting people off when they're full flow. No, it's all right. There's a chance to talk to Angela if you're particularly interested in some of the projects she was involved with afterwards. But quickly move on to Sonia.
Thank you. Welcome everyone, and thanks for being here tonight. I suppose I'm going to talk about who we are and the area that I come from, and some of the work that we do and why I'm passionate about that work. So I was going to start off by asking you a question to see what you know about where we live. So I'm from Liverpool. So how many people know anything about Liverpool? And is that associated with the football team or the football teams, should I say? And does anybody know of or have heard of the area called Liverpool 8?
Yes.
And would you know it more if I said the words Toxtus, which is normally associated with some really bad negative media portrayals of the community where I was brought up and where I live. And I suppose for me, that's not who we are, and it doesn't represent what we do and how we feel about where we live. And growing up in that area, for me, it was one of the most wonderful experiences, the most safest environments. And it definitely isn't what everybody reads about it in the newspaper. But Liverpool does come with challenges, and that's why our community set itself up. And it was set up by Black working class people in our community to take forward regeneration in our local area. We set up during lockdown, and we quickly gathered about 90 members. And there were two motivations, really. One was because we quickly realised that people didn't know what was going on in their own community, on their own noses, on their own doorstep. And also in response to an administrative scandal in the city that saw both the police and national government coming in to take control of our local authority under the scandal of land sales and gifts of land to private developers and other people, whereas the community wasn't able to access or acquire any of this land. But so Toxteth as an area where I grew up is where our CLT operates. It's the second most deprived ward or area in the city for income, and third most deprived in terms of barriers to housing and services. It's the area where the oldest Black community in Europe lives. And it's an area that's been hit with lots of disinvestment. It's been negatively impacted by schemes like neighbourhood renewal and housing market renewal. And it's an area that was written off nationally in the 80s and the 90s under the Thatcher government. So it's highly densely populated with private rental and social rental, and there's very little opportunity for local people to get onto the property ladder. And if you want to live by your mum or your dad or your neighbours you've grown up with, it's near on impossible. When you want to leave home, you've got to leave the area to get your own property. So in terms of that disbursement of the community, it's left us fractured, and it's left us with no community spirit. And that long standing approach to withdrawal of investments and services in the community has seen us all become independent and not working together. So we don't work as cohesively as we could have. Our community sits on the edge of the city centre, so it's prime real estate. And it's been attractive in the recent years to capitalist development investment to the detriment of the local community. And I think whilst we've had some challenges, we've also had some positives in that the last 3 years have seen our government introduce a community-led housing policy and programme and a community asset transfer policy and programme. And they are really given an opportunity to local community members to acquire assets in the community or develop land. It's not easy because it's been a very slow process, but I think both the authority and the community are on a learning curve and really struggling at times to figure out how some of these things work. And when we come off against blockages, then we have to look at how we solve them together. But we were set up really to empower local community members to take action because during lockdown, there were things going on in our community that we just didn't know. And I think during lockdown, we had lots of time to go out on walks and spend time on our own and start to really open your eyes to your community, finding out that land had been gifted to private developers for £1 or for free, and that the community had no say in what was going to be introduced into the community, or that roads were being turned into one-way systems, cycle lanes were being introduced right around the centre or through the community, and none of these decisions were being made with the community members who live there at the heart of the decision making, but they were building a great infrastructure as an access route to the city and the institutions in the city centre and the universities and other places, but to the detriment of the community. So in many ways, we set up in resistance to things that were happening around us. And to try and prevent further displacement of our community and have more control over being involved in what was going on, and trying to challenge that history of top-down regeneration with some real grassroots involvement. So we've identified a number of regeneration opportunities. We mapped out all the vacant land in our community, and And we identified a site that we were interested in that also fortunately became part of the community-led housing policy. And we bid for that site, and we were successful in being shortlisted as part of the expression of interest. We then put ourselves in for a competition called Design for All, and we were one of 2 organisations across the country to win that competition, which got us about £20,000 worth of time from a group of architects and consultants who could help us. And we've now got a design, which you'll see on some of the images outside later on, where we've got 18 homes, some retail units, and we will be able to support 81 people to remain in their community, with a community garden that will be accessible during working hours to the wider public, and then just to the residents of an evening. It's part of a wider site, which has the potential for us to do a lot more stuff on scale, but that would require a much deeper investment from our local authority and national policy to enable us to acquire these different pockets of land with different policies and resources. We do wider work as well. So not only are we doing this housing development scheme, but we've supported residents to address serious issues in their community around these road traffic orders and one-way systems. We've successfully objected to planning for a private developer who was also part of these scandals, who'd bought land from the church, which had a covenant on it, that was being ignored. It was only supposed to be for community use. Yeah, well, only supposed to be for community use. So we prevented that being developed, and we've also petitioned the CCG to prevent a chemist closure, which would have meant that there was no chemist within a 2.5-mile radius. So there's lots of work that we're doing in our community that we want to continue. And we want to do that by making sure we can fully embrace and be involved in the City Council's plan for our localities and communities.
Thanks very much, Sonia. Can I pass over to
John, diolch Sean, diolch am wahodd fi I siarad yma heddiw, so thank you very much for the invitation to speak here tonight. Like John mentioned, I'm from an organisation called Compass. We are a development agency working for positive change in Wales, and believe our society and economy should work differently. We've been established for over 40 years. We were set up in the 1980s out of the trade union movement, initially to help out-of-work miners to find alternative employment. And our heart is very much in the cooperative, social enterprise and community ownership sector. And like John said, I work as the community-led housing manager there, and some of you might be thinking, well, that's strange, you work in housing, why are you here talking about community ownership? But I see community ownership as a really key part for growing the community-led housing sector in Wales. And Welsh communities are currently the least empowered across the UK when it comes to community ownership and land reform. In Wales, we have a long history of communities doing things themselves, especially in terms of deindustrialisation in the South Wales valleys and in North Wales. But what we don't have is that sort of conversation around community ownership and land reform. Typically, the only route for community ownership in Wales is through the process of community asset transfers. Those asset transfers are typically from local authorities, and usually involve things like community centres, swimming pools, maybe some local parks, and some may question that they are transferring liabilities rather than assets to communities. It feels very much a reactive and reactive, not proactive approach to ownership. Local authorities are still holding all of the power. The power does not sit with the community. So it's currently on a sort of very small scale. There are some larger scale initiatives, nothing on the sort of scale of Neudart, but you have things like the Skyline project, which I know Chris is in the audience here today, and Penllygaya Woods, which are more around community woodland management and stewardship rather than community ownership. We are sort of dipping our toes into the water of community ownership in Wales. And unfortunately, the community asset transfer system in Wales just doesn't work for the majority of communities, if I'm honest. There's a completely inconsistent approach across local authorities in Wales. Some do it really, really well. Some do it really, really badly. And just things like the cost to purchase, the cost to maintain, the cost of feasibility of these buildings and what to do with them is a huge barrier for communities. The ability for communities to be able to act quickly to take these assets off the public authorities is very challenging, and even the capacity of communities to be able to get involved in these sorts of initiatives. These people are usually volunteers and doing these kind of initiatives in after work when the kids have gone to bed or when they're sort of not looking after their parents anymore. So just the sheer capacity of volunteers is obviously reducing people being able to get involved in these sorts of initiatives. The Localism Act did apply to Wales, so we could have had the same sort of rights that England has in terms of assets of community value, but unfortunately it was never enacted despite widespread support for that bill. So that was really unfortunate, given that we've got some really progressive legislation in Wales around the Wellbeing for Future Generations Act, for example, which should, in theory, ensure that public authorities think about the long term and do in terms of co-production. But unfortunately, that Localism Act was never initiated. And like I said, I see community ownership as a real catalyst for community-led housing in Wales. And like John mentioned at the start, we as a community-led housing hub in Wales are supporting over community groups across the country, and we have a pipeline to deliver over 300 affordable homes, which may sound like a drop in the ocean compared to the amount of homes that we need, but actually obviously those are vital homes in communities, providing affordable homes for people being able to stay in their community. And land is a huge barrier for these community groups wanting to develop affordable housing. Just the cost, the competition, and the funding needed to be able to access land is a huge barrier for groups. So as a result, we decided to try and do something about it. So alongside other organisations in Wales, did some lobbying a couple of years ago and some research in terms of what can we actually do to change the way that we own our land currently in Wales. So like I said, we did some research, and alongside the Institute of Welsh Affairs, which is a think tank in Wales, lobbied the Welsh Government to try and bring in some community ownership and community right to buy legislation. The Institute of Welsh Affairs found that there was widespread support for community ownership. So a survey that they conducted found that there was 68% support for community ownership in Wales, and that 71% of people believed that funding was required to go alongside it. So as a result, Welsh Government actually listened to all of us and held an inquiry into this subject a couple of years ago, and have now set up a community ownership commission, which has taken the form of a task and finish group, which we sit on as Compass alongside various different organisations across Wales. So this task and finish group is set up to stimulate thinking about community ownership in Wales. So hopefully over the coming months, a report will be released in terms of what are the next steps for community ownership in Wales. And like I said, we have some really progressive legislation in terms of the Wellbeing for Future Generations Act. And with Senedd elections in 2026, we feel it's a really prime opportunity for the Welsh Government to bring in legislation, to listen to community groups, to listen to the public, to enact a community right to buy in Wales. We don't see it as the silver bullet, and that's all that should happen. We appreciate that it needs to come alongside funding, a supportive infrastructure network, and we're really keen, I suppose, to learn from the experiences of Scotland and England as well, to ensure that whatever we develop in Wales is right for Welsh communities.
Without further ado, on to Nick.
Thank you, and hi everyone. So I want to spend the next few minutes really kind of talking through the English policy context on community ownership, and specifically focusing on community right to buy policy, which is set to be introduced at some point this year, kind of how we got here and where it might take us. Just a couple of things, firstly about me and Power to Change. So been working on community ownership stuff for about 10 years, see it as a kind of vital tool in our kind of economic, social, environmental policy toolkit. I also grew up in a housing cooperative in Leeds, so kind of community-led change is something that's been a big part of my life. And Power to Change, we've been around for 10 years now. It's our 10th anniversary this year, and work with community businesses across England. So there's roughly 11,000 of those community businesses, many of whom community ownership is at the heart of their kind of business models, provides them a really sustainable asset base from which to run their organisations. So just a bit on the policy context and where we are now. So Casey just mentioned there the kind of Localism Act of 2011 and the fact that Wales missed out. In some ways, I don't think Wales missed out on much. So the community right to bid, which was one of the community rights introduced in 2011, we really think it's been kind of relatively weak, relatively ineffective. So we did some research a few years ago looking into that policy and the impact it has had. Found that just 15 in every 1,000 assets that are listed as assets of community value end up in community ownership. So kind of a tiny proportion of those that are listed. That's not the full story. I think listing assets as assets of community value can have great value, and I'll get into that. But that's kind of where we are. I think the listing process can be really effective because of the way in which it kind of catalyses community action. So even if it doesn't directly lead to community ownership, we've seen that time and time again. An example of this near to me, I'm based in London, is the Sister Midnight Community Benefit Society in Lewisham. So they listed a local pub, they were looking to take ownership of it, turn it into a kind of community-owned pub and music venue. In the end, that didn't lead anywhere, but it's led them to kind of occupancy of a building owned by Lewisham Council where they can run that project from. And there are a whole range of assets across England that have been listed as ACVs that have ended up being purchased by communities. Everything from community pubs through to high-profile assets like the Gig Lane Stadium in Bury, which is taken over by supporters of the Bury football team. I think there's also real appetite for community ownership. So Power to Change's recent research of our community business market work, which was a kind of survey of community businesses across England, found that a third of community businesses see acquiring assets and land as a priority for them in the coming year, and 40% of them would focus on land and building occupation more generally. So it's a real kind of area of interest for community businesses. So on to community right to buy. So in some ways, I think the policy idea, which learns so much from Scotland, and we're constantly looking north of the border for inspiration, in some ways is a kind of fairly narrow improvement on community right to bid. So the idea being that communities will have first right of refusal on assets when they come up for sale, rather than just being considered as part of the bidding process. But think it could be a real catalyst for thinking differently about social, environmental, economic progress. And that could be huge. So community ownership as a proactive tool for economic renewal, Casey mentioned as well. And I think that kind of shift from reactiveness to proactiveness, it has to be a part of this story. There are just a few kind of details on the policy which I think are worth mentioning. We did some research on this last year, so speaking to people in Scotland, speaking to civil servants that are involved in the initial drafting of the Localism Act, speaking to other experts, and came up with a few recommendations on how you get the community right to buy right, essentially. So I think firstly, there's got to be a process of expanding the definition of assets of community value. So including assets which have the potential in future to improve social and economic and environmental well-being. So a really broad definition is going to help us get to that proactive picture on community ownership. Casey's mentioned and others have mentioned ensuring that new powers are accompanied by funding and support. I think that's one of the stories in Scotland with the Scottish Land Fund. Community Ownership Fund, which we had in recent years, has been positive to a large degree. So funding and support necessary alongside the power. And then I think there's something around communication and supporting places to use it. So I think one of the things in England which is different from Scotland, there isn't this kind of culture of community ownership, the history that you have in Scotland. So it needs to be really strongly communicated. We've spoken about the idea of potential kind of trailblazer areas that use the right first and are supported to do so, to show people what's possible and bring that to people's attention essentially. One of the other things, one of the other recommendations that we made, which in some ways we're kind of living now, is to share learning between the nations. So one of the things that we think government should do is establish a tri-national learning group so that we can all learn from the different community ownership policy landscapes and how our stories can help one another move forward. But fundamentally, I think that moving away from this at-risk framing and saving framing, which for so many people is often the catalyst, and I think it's a really important way that people get brought into community ownership and get an understanding of the idea. We need to move away from that in the ACV definition, in the way that community ownership funding works, so that we can move to that much more proactive community-led development. I think the example of Hastings Commons, which some of you might know, is a really great example of this kind of proactive community-led economic regeneration and development. They're a great community-led group that's doing everything from housing to workspace to town centre regeneration, and that sort of model is what we should be aiming for. And just to finish, I want to say, so as I've said a couple of times, we so often look north of the border to Scotland for inspiration, and we don't have the same kind of emotional resonance of community ownership here in England. So I'd like to see the community right to buy and making sure that policy is done well be the beginning of a new movement for English community ownership, not the end.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much, Nick, and the other contributors. I think what I'll do now is we'll bring out some of those themes, but I don't want it just to stay on the stage. I really want to engage, and I'm sure lots of people would like to question some of the things, but just one or two aspects of that. And thanks, Nick, for coming up at the end with policy responses to some of these. In Scotland, we're always looked at as leading the charge here. Not perfect in Scotland. We have our own issues, and I was just really going to ask the panel, what policy response would help your communities to move forward in an easier and more lubricated way, if you like, that we don't have at the moment, and which we would prefer to see. Does anybody want to handle?
I think as a community who now owns the land, so it's for us, this has been very selfish, I suppose. It's less about the sort of kind of policy supporting land reform per se. It would be on the more practical side for for what we want to achieve with regard to roles of statutory agencies. And for us, we're trying to develop a nature reserve, yet we are held back by Nature Scot and agencies who really should be working with communities to achieve climate change, nature, ecological restoration. So I think there's something there. Maybe it's not so less about policy and more about the sort of structural side of government agencies there. I think there is a lot, or there is something around natural capital, which again is probably more on the practical side of things, but seeing land being brought up for natural capital and the impact that has on communities wanting to buy, or for communities who do own land and are getting embroiled in being sold the idea that their land is going to generate and lots of income through carbon credits. I think there's a whole area around there that is a combination of both policy and getting government agencies to actually understand the issues. So that's my magic wand for change.
Sonia, you gave us colourful examples of communities you work with reacting and trying to take on issues. How might it be easier for them to do that?
I think probably one of the ways that policy restricts us is that it doesn't give us the agency or the power to make change. There's a massive mistrust of local people in local communities. There is a massive disconnect between an understanding that just because you're from a community doesn't mean you haven't got the skills. For example, I've worked at quite a senior level in local government, yet within the community, I am seen by officers who are the equivalent of what I was in the local authority as just a community member who doesn't have no skills or experience or knowledge. So that's a major issue, which prevents us from being able to progress based on trust. As communities, the organisations and funders we work with also are challenged by not understanding whether we can manage money. And so you have to convince them of those things as well. And I think one of the other big things is about information sharing and knowledge. Information is power. If you don't have that information, you're not able to act and you're not able to enact agency. We have 5 assets. You were talking about assets of community value. I was astounded to find that in Liverpool, we only have ever, in the whole time they've been running this programme, registered 5 assets of community value, and we've registered 1 of them. And when we talked about it, the one department from the other in the local authority didn't know that we'd registered it. So I think silo working between agencies is another big issue that needs to be addressed as part of this. People need to work together to empower us, to give us the agency to be able to do this work, because we have the innovation, the creativity and the passion that they don't have about our communities to enable us to do this in really, truly transformational ways.
You mentioned community asset transfer being different, but you've had some success in making it better, or are there other ways in which it could be better still?
Yeah, I think the easy answer for me is that sort of community right to buy legislation. Looking obviously to learn from Scotland, I think having that legislation would make it far easier for that community asset transfer process, but also, like Nick was saying, sort of raise awareness of community ownership and land reform, and give communities the sort of power to be able to take on not just your small community centres, but your large scale sort of wind farms and nature reserves and that kind of thing. So I think that legislation is really, really important for Wales. And not only will it help Welsh communities, but I think Welsh Government now have been talking about community ownership, community asset transfer for a very long time. And I think they need to stick their flag in the ground essentially and say we are actually really supportive of this. And obviously, if they enact legislation, then that shows their commitment to this agenda. So I think legislation is really key for us. And like we were saying, it's not just about the legislation, it's about the funding and support infrastructure that comes with it. So I think that's really important. And I suppose just from a sort of a cultural perspective, there's obviously large debates in Wales happening at the minute in terms of Welsh-speaking communities cannot remain within their communities, cannot live in their communities, don't have any opportunities in their communities. And it's been found that community ownership is actually a way of securing those communities and making them more sustainable. So I think now is a really important time for us to think about policy and legislation to ensure that Welsh speaking and other communities across Wales can take ownership of their own destiny.
Nick, want to add any more to that? I mean, you've already talked about community rights in England. I'm less familiar with where you're at on that and what's next and how do you persuade government to actually introduce things seriously rather than limp.
Yes,
Apology for land reform.
So we're expecting the English Devolution Bill at some point this year, probably not before summer, and think there's lots of work to be done kind of behind the scenes, which lots of people in this room are involved in, to try and push that in the right direction. But then there's also the kind of the progression of the legislation through Parliament and making sure that we're using all our political allies to lay amendments and make sure it's as strong as it possibly can be. The other thing that I just wanted to add is I think, so at Power to Change, we're involved in something called the We're Right Here campaign, which is a campaign for community power legislation, one of the rights being community right to buy, but also talking about a community right to shape public services. But the most important one, I think, is a community right to control investment. So we've spoken quite a bit about funding today. And I think that so often the story that we hear from community businesses is one of kind of piecing together lots of different pots of funding from lots of different sources to get community ownership projects off the ground, and they're really good at it. But how can you kind of shift the default so that there's a kind of presumption that certain bits of investment are best held at the community level? So for us, we want to see the English Devolution Bill be the start of devolution beyond the town hall into communities, and it not just being about community right to buy, but about community right to control investment, which we think would be really, a really important way of getting the funding and support into communities.
That's interesting. In Scotland, we're currently looking at community wealth building the bill. Not quite at the beginning of that yet, which is very much trying to ensure that investment stays in communities and doesn't all leak out. So the community right to control investment. Josh, can you take that down as something to take forward? One other theme that I'll just use panel members for, and then we'll open it wider. This whole idea about community capacity and community, the voluntary burnout issue. How do you build community capacity? How do you ensure there's a legacy and there's a succession? Anybody got any good experience of this? Because it's an issue that comes up with us a lot, is maintaining that enthusiasm within communities to maintain the momentum of change.
I'll answer that for you.
Yes, go on.
I think some of that's about legacy, and it's about intergenerational relationships and work, and us not just being the gatekeepers of this movement and making sure that we bring younger people from our communities in and get them involved in our activities, and making sure that we are building our communities for the future. They're not about us, you know, in many ways. It's, you know, it's not for us what we're doing. It's for people who come behind us. So I think there's a big role within our movement around empowering the younger generation, instilling some of those values that have been lost in society. You know, we're a movement of 350 CLTs across the UK, and we have a real opportunity to impact change across society in many ways. But that does need investment. You know, a lot of that can't come from the volunteers' time, and those volunteers, you know, become burnt out. A lot of that is about investing in people for the future, and building up those resources so that we can train people, educate them, develop them, give them opportunities, not just, you know, to do volunteering, but employment on the schemes that we're developing, you know, and to get them more actively involved in everything that we're doing.
Good point.
Just a couple of thoughts on that. So one of the things that Power to Change was involved with a few years ago is a piece of work called Empowering Places. So we worked in, I think it was 5 or 6 places across England, Grimsby, Wigan, Leicester, Hartlepool. So places that suffer kind of economic challenges, but really starting from the principle that there is capacity in every community. It just needs kind of unlocking. And the approach we took there was trying to find a kind of catalyst organisation or individual. So recognising that even in places with a kind of lower density of civil society organisations and kind of economic deprivation challenges, there are really great people and great organisations working in those places, finding them and then supporting them to be catalysts in the wider community. So some really great examples. I'm thinking particularly in somewhere like Hartlepool, where an organisation called the Annex, which is a great kind of community centre up there, has helped to seed kind of new community businesses in the area. And I think that sort of approach where you're finding some of that energy, supporting it, and then letting it kind of ripple out is a really good way of approaching things.
Yeah, I would just, I suppose, echo Nick's sort of the importance of the support infrastructure. I would say that coming from a community-led housing hub, we are considered a support infrastructure body. But yeah, I think you can't underestimate. I think it like Sonia was saying, it is all about harnessing the sort of them along on the journey. But I suppose our job really is to add capacity to community groups when they can't write funding bids or go and speak to politicians. It's our role to support them. It's not about taking over. The communities know their communities better than we do, so it's not about us taking the power, but I suppose it's just holding their hand through that journey and giving them the support that they need to make their community initiative happen.
Angela, anything?
The only other thing, and again, this is supposed coming down to the practical end, but every community landowner that I've worked with, there are always at some point of a cycle, there's always at some point where, you know, interest drops off, and it's how you maintain that. I think ironically, sometimes in a smaller community, it's easier to get the support than it is maybe in a sort of kind of small town where things can feel a little bit more distant. And I think it's how it would be great to have access to practical support on HR, on finance, on, as a community landowner, you can, if you take our development trust, we went from being literally one day an organisation with, you know, I don't know, maybe we had a sort of £50,000 turnover to suddenly owning assets worth 6 million plus, employing 5 staff and all the different activities in it. And that means, you know, we're a member of probably about 8 different organisations, because Community Land Scotland, DTAS, Community Woodlands Association, South Scotland Community Housing. There's how you find the information you need to support your activities in a cost-effective way. It's fine when you're employing staff, they've got their expertise, but for the board, it's scary. And you don't want to put people off. You want to know that you've got suitable support systems in place so people can do that volunteer job.
I can just add, yes, I'm just going to come to questions, and Ian, if you can, just anecdotally, in some of the organisations and communities I've been involved with over many years, and everybody has said, oh, this all takes time. You don't change things immediately in these situations. 2 points. One is that once a community owns a bit of land, it doesn't necessarily have to control everything about that land. It can actually encourage private businesses, individuals to do things in that. It's not exclusively a community owned and run facility. First thing. Second thing is that a lot of communities where we were having depopulation, and Noida's a good example of this. Inevitably in these remoter communities, they have to leave to go to, young people have to leave to go to school and university and work elsewhere. A lot of them have come back as because they realise the value of living in these kind of communities, and have set up their own business, have become involved in the boards of these organisations, and I can give you several examples of where that has happened, that return migration of younger people who have had a link with that community in the first place. Just said that in passing. No, questions? There's one, this man's very keen, and
this topic, if you could hold that. I wanted to come in on this topic. Chris Blake from Wales. I've been involved in community asset management as a board member, volunteer for 15 years more, many projects. There's a danger in this community. I completely agree we need support for organisations, for board training, for development. Some cash, some grants would be great, but be careful. The big opposition from a lot of public bodies for not transferring assets is they say, oh, well, you can't look after it. There won't be succession. You'll run out of a few volunteers will run out. We can't trust that you'll still be running in 10 years' time. And so that's, in my experiences and looking around the room, that's not true. You've had decades long of experience, and boards go through pines when the founders run out of energy, but they keep going. I mean, in Scotland, how many decades have been successfully doing? And so, yes, we need support, but be aware of how successfully we're delivering that, and be aware that it's been one of the main criticisms and one of the main blocks for that asset transfer to take place.
That's a good point. One thing about Scotland is we've been at it for so long. We actually do have evidence now of success, of achievement and outcomes, which we can use increasingly to say to policymakers and funders, this works. Yeah. And you want to encourage more of it because it's actually achieving what you, the government, want. Next question. Where's this thing you can throw about?
Is this a microphone? Microphone.
This is actually a microphone.
A microphone.
Okay. To the next speaker.
Okay. All right. I just wanted to flag a couple of events that are happening in London tomorrow morning and middle of the day tomorrow related to what's been discussed. There's an event at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. It's Wales Week in London this week, so here for Cymru. And there's an event on the Future Generations Act at 8 o'clock tomorrow at Arup. And there's also tomorrow at 1 o'clock, there's an online webinar by We're Right Here, which is the kind of coalition campaign for community rights by, just to flag those. Just what I'd like to say is that basically there's evidence from all over the world that when land is in community hands, nature prospers more than when it isn't. And the private, corporate and government ownership of land in the British Isles over the last 1,000 years has led us to an absolute catastrophe for nature. We've lost 70% of our biodiversity since I've been alive. Our rivers are polluted, every single one of them. And it's therefore imperative that we move land into community ownership at scale and at pace. So what I'd like to ask is, if each of you had a magic wand, what obstacle to that happening would you remove?
Rush to go first.
All the easy questions.
I'll go first and say the easy answer.
That's
Some
Wales, Wales Day.
some funding for community groups to be able to own these assets. I think that's it. I'll go with the easy option.
For acquiring.
Yeah.
Right.
From who? Government?
Government, social investors. I don't think we can be reliant on the government solely for this. Social investors, community shares, peer-to-peer lending, a whole concoction of funding.
Great. I agree.
Sorry, I didn't get you. Did you say who you were? Just in case.
So I'm from an organisation called Woodland Savers, and we help communities to buy and manage land for nature recovery
Right.
across the UK.
Here's the man to go and see.
And I would say we are working on a community land fund for Wales, and we'd be interested to do one in Scotland as well. Been in meetings about that today.
Right. That's encouraging. You asked a question, I can't remember what it was now. You responded. Anybody else in the panel want to say?
What was it? If you had a magic wand?
Yes, the magic wand, the magic wand.
What would you make happen? What obstacle to, the transfer of land ownership at scale back to communities?
I think some of the hierarchical structures and the silo working, I think they are big barriers to enabling policy to be delivered on the ground. So that's what I would look to remove.
What kind of structures do you mean?
I'm talking about structures within the institutions, within national governments that actually involve the funding. There's so many barriers and so many tick boxes and so many people need to sign off processes that they get in the way of actually doing the business.
It's a culture shift. Yes.
So 2 points. Firstly, on the Chris's comments, I think it's a really important point that I think support and funding is really important, but I think there also needs to be a degree of kind of confidence in the organisations that we're all involved in and support and work with. Had Change recently I mentioned our community business market report, and we looked at the kind of levels of confidence and resilience in the sector, which when compared with the kind of traditional businesses, community businesses come out slightly better. So I think there is something about being clear that yes, these things are hard and they take a lot of work, but actually with the right sort of structures in place, these organizations can be strong, successful, sustainable, even more so than kind of traditional bits of the economy that that's often taken as a given. And then on the point on community ownership of land for nature stewardship, I think for me, I mentioned it before, but I think there is a real fight with this community right to buy legislation, that if you get the definition as broad as possible, so that environmental well-being is part of that, and then you do the work to really kind of up people's imagination. So some of the examples we've heard from Scotland about what community ownership of land in a really large scale can do, and the impact that can have on nature recovery, and bring those stories and kind of up people's imaginations here in England. I think that's one of the ways that you're going to get there, but I don't think it's a given that we get there on the community right to buy policy.
I think that would be quite a big magic wand. And I'm kind of assuming that the magic wand for the fine has already been enacted. I'd like to see, I don't know, courage from government to sort of kind of challenge the fundamental aspects around land ownership. We can talk about community asset transfer, that's great, but it's how do you break that monopoly on land that allows the community to be able to then access for funding to be able to buy it. I mean, yeah, we've made good inroads in Scotland, but there's still a way to go. And I see, I mean, where we are in the south of Scotland, the Clue, who are breaking up their land holdings, individual farms, 15 farms have been sold to a commercial forestry company. Now, that hasn't done anything for land ownership. It's been a transfer from one big landowner to another big landowner. And yeah, don't get me wrong, I'm not knocking commercial forestry, it's needed. But I'd like to see a government be prepared to, I don't know, take the bull by the horns and actually look at the impact that monopolies of land ownership has. And that goes for companies who are buying it for carbon credits and conservation purposes as well.
Can I just
on that one? I think that's a really, really good point. There's so much land that is in private ownership within Liverpool by people who don't live in the city but are not developing the land. They're just waiting for it to rise in cost. And I think that's a big challenge. I was talking to somebody before about it in the audience, that it is a challenge and we need governments who are bold enough to be able to release some of that land for local communities. If you're not going to develop it, you know, how do we acquire it and how do we make something really positive in our own communities and for you?
Question at the back, sorry, I'm just trying to get them in the right order.
My name's Lorraine Hart. I, as you can probably tell, come from London and I'm a town bird, and I'm interested in the extent to which there is a real difference between urban and rural communities when it comes to access to land. But I wanted to throw out a suggestion really rather than a question, which is the community right to buy will be no good unless people know who owns land and buildings.
Yeah.
The land registry has got that information. It needs to be made free and publicly available. If I think about the community energy and outrage that can be released, imagine if every ward in every, for me, London borough had a map that showed who owned what. Not only, they say that light and fresh air is the best disinfectant. We're never going to get this government, Starmer and Reason, never going to challenge land ownership, but we might be able to if there was a bit more transparency. So a key element of community right to buy and making it easier, I think. I mean, if I think about the work of Andy Whiteman in Scotland and what he did to shed some light on those things, we need a similar kind of power, a right to that information about land and who owns it and where they are. I was involved in an asset of community value designation, 6 holding companies for 1 pub. It took us weeks to just find someone to talk to about it. You can't even get to the registration process without it. Sorry.
Does it actually do something?
My name's Richard Lee from a group called People's Land Policy, which is a group of volunteers. We see ourselves as a grassroots group. And we've had a number of webinars and conferences and events. And from those, we've produced a publication, some of which I've shared tonight, called Towards a Land Manifesto. And we're looking at England in this case, but we have solidarity with Wales too. And really following on from Lorraine, the last speaker's point, we in our manifesto, we completely support community right to buy, and it needs to be at scale. It needs to be properly resourced through a land fund, as they had in Scotland. All of that's excellent, but in our opinion, it's just touching the surface. It's really just touching the surface, and we feel quite strongly that we need to have an approach that looks at the whole vision for land in our country or countries. And we like the term, which we've gathered a lot of support from at a local level. We like the term of the commons, because we think that it says so much more than these debates between public and private and all the campaigning around stopping the sale of public land, but for what purpose? And we think that the commons is a really important concept. So to get to my question, we're very keen on a Land Reform Act for England. And I'd like to know from the panel For the Scottish representative, what do you feel the ingredients were that enabled Land Reform Acts to actually introduce legislation in Scotland? What can we learn to actually put in place in England and Wales? And for the others, would you be supportive of a Land Reform Act for England and Wales? Because to be honest, we don't see it a lot from the larger organisations actually saying, yes, and fundamentally, we need in England and Wales a Land Reform Act. Would you support that?
I answer the
Yes.
Scottish bit. And this is dangerous ground. It worked because we had a parliament. We had our own parliament. And when we were part of the Westminster Parliament, land reform would never have been on the agenda. But when we had our own devolved Parliament, land reform shot up the political agenda as something important for reasons that others have mentioned: lack of transparency, foreign ownership, absentee ownership, depopulation of more tertiary areas. So that was one of them, and there is a cultural, historical aspect to land ownership in Scotland as well. I think so that combination of actually having the power to actually introduce legislation that would affect Scotland, and the traditional cultural aspects of merged together. I don't know if you want to add anything, or Josh. Our policy man from Community Land Scotland, who's helping us steer through the Land Reform Bill in Scotland and many other bits of legislation. Anything you'd like to add, or?
No, not really. I think you covered it off, John. I think the cultural point is a big one. And there was a question for Casey really around the connections between Welsh-speaking communities and some of the culture and history of resistance there with the Gaelic-speaking communities in Scotland, because a lot of the movement came from those communities. So I wonder if there's a kind of some conversations that can be had around collaboration there. But
Yeah.
And in your response to do you want a Land Reform Act in Wales, I'd be interested in why the Localism Act wasn't enacted. But yeah, John, I think you've covered that off. The cultural historical point is important, but the political agency to deliver something that was high on the political agenda. And even though in Scotland, land reform has been stalling for a number of years and we have a lot of issues, it is a mainstream political agenda. Land reform is accepted by all of the main parties apart from the party you'd expect to not support it.
If anybody finds out why the Localism Act wasn't enacted in Wales, please let me know. I don't think anybody knows. There was widespread support for it. In terms of the sort of Welsh-speaking point, I think, yeah, there's definitely a conversation and a lot to be learnt between nations, because I think the majority of activism in this area has come from those communities who maybe don't feel like the Welsh Government or local authorities actually are there to serve them. So just do things for themselves, essentially. So I think, yeah, definitely worth having a conversation. And yeah, in terms of the land reform question, obviously these powers are devolved to Wales and we have our own Welsh Government. So this is something that we are considering at the minute, and the commission that has been set up is sort of in the process now of sort of deciding what is next for Wales, and we shall see what comes out of the elections in 2026.
I'm going to take, I think we got time for one more question.
Maybe you could take two together.
We've got some online ones, or do we?
Yeah.
And let's take the lady here.
Thank you.
Two together.
Thank you. My name's Georgina and I am the campaign officer for Sustain on our Sustainable Farming campaign. And I used to work for Plunkett UK, so I know a bit about community ownership. My question follows on from the point about transparency of land ownership. And I'm interested across the different nations, if any of the panelists have recommendations for how to make land more transparent. So we've obviously had the idea already from the audience about making the information free to access on the land registry. Is there anything else, to force landowners, for example, to list their land publicly? I'm just interested to hear your suggestions.
Okay, this is gonna be weird because I'm also from the same charity, but my question's actually different. So I think there's a few of us from Sustain. We're a food and farming policy and campaigning organization. And so I think for us, it's very much the work that we do is so hindered by the big element of the cost of land, the cost of housing, and there's very little innovation that can be had around making healthy, sustainable food accessible to all. So I suppose the kind of maybe a bit of a broader question is, should we see a bit more of an aligning of our movements, because I think they overlap so much with each other. I think from community businesses, many of which are really food focused, this question around access to land, access to infrastructure as being critical around transforming our food supply chains. Why aren't we sort of seeing more collaboration, or should this be a moment for us to kind of combine forces around our shared goals?
Anybody want to tackle the transparency and of ownership topic, which is we could lend you Andy Whiteman, and I would love to do it if you did him well. But even Andy would admit he hasn't got it all yet. And once you get the owner, it doesn't necessarily mean that you actually know who the beneficial owner is, because it can be a range of offshore companies and subsidiaries and like that.
Yeah, so it's something that Power to Change have done a bit of work on in the past, particularly in relation. We've done a lot of work on high streets and high street regeneration, and so often the challenge on with vacant high street properties is not having a handle on who owns them. Thinking of a community business down in Plymouth, Nudge Community Builders, their story is one of kind of wading through various bits of paperwork to find out something's owned within a trust, within another trust. And that whole picture there has just, been a nightmare, and one they've managed to navigate. There was some movement in England on beneficial register of ownership in relation to overseas ownership, which we were kind of pushing on. Not quite sure where that's got to at the moment. On the question from the front there on aligning of movements, I mean, I think, and it'd be again interesting to hear a bit more about the kind of Scottish experience, but to me it feels like you get progress on these sorts of things when there's a real kind of groundswell of support for something. And one of the things I was saying in my kind of earlier remarks was around how can we view community right to buy, and that as just the start of a kind of English community ownership movement, English commons movement, I don't know. But I mean, I think that sort of thing, working out what the actual kind of area of overlap, shared interest is, could be really useful.
And I think it's probably important to see how that relates at a grassroots level as well. So there's lots of opportunities on some of the opportunities to acquire land to do many different things on them, and do that all at the same time as you know, collaborative approaches. So I think understanding how those movements relate on the ground enables us to think more creatively about how we can work together.
I'm very conscious of time, and I've got one other potential question here. I do want to remember there's 100 people watching this online. Are there any specific? If there was one question coming out of that chat, Gavin, would you ask that?
Hi everybody. There's been a lot of agreement with what's been said in the chat. A lot of kudos to you guys. The main question that's came up has been started by Catherine from Canada, who asked, what are the panel's thoughts on how things can be improved from the Scottish perspective? We've heard a lot about these early parts of the rest of the nation, but Scotland specifically has done some wonderful things. But what, in the panel's opinion, can be done to improve it?
I think this is the day conference. Do we want to? There's several things. There's a major review of the community rights to buy going on just now, under some pressure from activists that the community rights to buy weren't working for various reasons. And so there's a major review being undergone right as we speak by government. And we'd like to think some improvements would come out of that might be along the lines of what some suggestions have been here. And of course, we also have a draft land reform bill, which is going through the committee stage just now and is being rigorously and aggressively interrogated by people who think it's not strong enough. So I suppose in response to Catherine, the question is that we're aware that whereas Scotland, a lot has been achieved, and we like to think that we're a model and we'd love to share our experiences with you. There are still improvements and there is still growth in that movement to take place, and there's still legislative and other hurdles to be overcome in Scotland that we'd be very happy to share with you. And the outcomes of that review of community rights to buy and the land reform bill as it's currently being discussed, we'd be very happy to share, and very happy for you to suggest to us how it might be better as well. So it's a quick answer to a long question. No, I'm very conscious of time. This poor man has been asking his hand up for. You have the honour of the last question.
Thank you. On the issue about land ownership and transparency, the real problem is that I think 30% of the land in England and possibly Wales is not registered, and it's to do with power. People don't want to know. They don't. The landowners don't want you to know that they own this land. But my question is really about the government's white paper in England on the land use framework. This seems to be an opportunity for land reformers to get to grips with some of these issues. And indeed, the white paper itself talks about more transparency on ownership. And there are, I think, Guy Shrubsall's book is very relevant here. And he's worked a lot about, water companies owning SSIs. And I do think this is an opportunity here. And I'd be interested to hear, what campaign groups are active on this front.
Question for our English colleagues in particular?
No.
Sorry.
Could you? There's a consultation at the moment open. We spoke to Max Haber, who's the head of the land use framework. I'm over here. Oh, well. Been exposed. Yeah, so the consultations. Oh, thank you. Yeah, the consultation's open until the 25th of April. And yeah, it asks a couple of pretty relevant questions. Discussion this evening, it asks about the transparency of land data in England, looking at things like Ordnance Survey and Land Registry and what we could do to make that more easily accessible, and also sets out the sort of wider vision for land use in England out to 2050 as well. So worth taking a look indeed. I was to blow your coat at all. It lasted a while, thanks. At the Q&A.
Okay, I think I'm going to have to call. I'll just say we could go on for a long time, and these are interesting questions that need deeper answers. But thank you for asking them. We're going to finish off with a cultural element, if you like. It was interesting. Simon Fraser, in whose name this event is taking place. He was very interested in the culture. He was a Gaelic speaker, but he was also very interested in Gaelic history. And I remember when I worked with him quite closely on one or two big buyouts. I've held the bags basically, and Simon did the work. And Simon, the celebration for the purchase of the island of Bia, which was one of the bigger purchases, both in value and influence at the time. There was a fairly robust celebration. And at the event, Simon brought his daughter, who played the bagpipes, and was invited to play the pipes at the celebratory Haley. And it's remarkable the amount of attention he got from every male in Gia for this woman who could play the bagpipes very well, but that was very much part of the culture, part of the celebratory element of Community Land. We have Chris Ellis with us. Chris is a musician. He's also a filmmaker and a performer. He's particularly interested in how the arts can help people and communities to tell their stories. And I think that's important. We've heard about the need to tell stories about film in particular, and to celebrate past and present struggles. He combines song, spoken word, film and image to chart the struggles for land rights and social justice in the UK. So we're delighted that he's going to come along and give us a rounding off of the cultural elements of land reform and community activism in the country. So I'm going to brief this.
Thank you. It's genuinely, it's an honour to be here. It's been very really interesting and inspiring. I feel I need to know a lot more about something which is a subject that's really close to my heart. I came along with a kind of a half a dozen songs and settled on the two of listening. And the first is probably always going to be the first one because it's based around here. It dates from words date from 1649, and they were written by Gerald Stanley and a bunch of other people about 20 miles west of here, I think. St George's Hill. Anyone know St George's Hill now? I mean, you must be. It's like a gated community, I believe, that's for the super rich. Just after the English Civil War, it was a bunch of it was waste ground and not looked after. And there was an absentee landlord who was hanging on to it. I don't know if they were land banking or what. But Winstanley and his fellow families, these guys were short of food, made the decision to go there and to dig. Leon Russell wrote this song about 50 years ago, and the reason I like it is because it has the original words that the diggers wrote. So they created the Diggers' Declaration, and Russellson put their words into the song. So that's what I'm going to do first. "1649, St George's Hill. A ragged band they called the diggers came to show the peoples who defied the landlords, defied the law. They were the dispossessed, claiming they was theirs. Come in peace, they said, to dig and to sow. We come to work this land in common, to make this wasteland grow. 75, make a hole. So let it be a common treasury for all. Sin of property, we do the same. No man has any right to buy or sell for private gain. By theft and murder, they took this land. Now everywhere, walls rise up around the man. And they make the laws to tame us well. The clergy dazzle us with heaven, or damn us into hell. We will not worship the gods they serve. A God of greed feeds the rich while the morning starve. Conquer them by love, coming now. Conquer them by love, coming now. Conquer them by love, as it does you, behold. But it's king above, no power is like to love. Stand up now, diggers all. From the men of property, the orders came. They sent the hired hands and the troopers to wipe out these diggers' claims, down their cottages and burn their corn. They were dispersed, but the patient is on. 1649, George's Hill, a ragged band they call the diggers came to show the people's will. They defied the landlords, defied the law. They were the dispossessed, claiming what was theirs. I like songs with stories woven into them. And I don't want to impose on what's going to be a very valuable chat you guys are going to have any second. So, just this one song. It was written by Guthrie. 1940, he was fed up with listening to the radio and hearing a song called America by Irving Berlin. That's the story. And he sat down and he wrote this song. And I learned this song first in Welsh. I was singing it with a band on Ynys Môn. And I can't sing it in Welsh. But I remember Arfon when you taught me the song, said this is about the Tyrion deer. And I said, what does Tyrion deer mean? And he said, there's no direct translation in English. But I think he said tender land comes close. I don't know if that's, but I've never forgotten that. And so he sat down annoyed with this stuff coming off the radio and he wrote a page of a protest song. And the spirit was who? Who's America? Who's America's God blessing? My America, your America. And it included verses about poverty and hunger. Then America entered the war. Guthrie sang the song without those verses because, as a patriot, he also didn't want to criticise the government when it was having a tough time. I think that's an important part of what gets woven into every story about radical protest, because almost always, when you get to a point of saying something, some war comes along, everybody has to shut up for a while, and it's all going to be fine afterwards. It seems to be written into a lot of movements now. So it interests me that Guthrie left those verses out. I'm going to put one on the back in tonight. And that's the one about land and private property. But the thing I really love about it is there's a famous line in this song. It's really the hook of the song, and it's not in that first draft. He wrote all this stuff about land, and then scrolled across the top afterwards, he wrote, "This land was made for you and me." And then he wrote after that he said these 8 words, you could repeat them and repeat them. There's so much in them. This land was made for you and me. And that became woven into the song. It wasn't the first intention, it was where he got to with it. I think I just need a glass of water. It's a bit dry. This land is your land. This land is my land. From California to New York Island, the redwood forests, the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me. Now as I was walking that ribbon of highway, I saw above me endless sky. I saw below me the golden valley. I've roamed and rambled, followed my footsteps to the sparkling sands of a diamond desert. And all around me, a voice was calling, this land was made for you. This land is your land, this land is my land. California to New York Island, redwood forests, and the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me. Now as I was strolling, the fog was lifting, with the dust clouds rolling, and the wheat fields waving, sun shining, and a voice was chanting, this land was made for you. Now as I was strolling, I saw a sign there, and that sign said, this is private property. But on the other side, it didn't say nothing. That sign was made for you and me. This land is your land, this land is my land. From the downs to the western highlands, our oakwood forests, our lakeland waters. This land was made for you and me.
Chris, thank you very much. What a nice, inspiring way to bring the proceedings to a close. I was going to try and sum up the meeting and the points, but I think maybe only 3 or 4. First of all, community ownership can achieve things, and we've got evidence of that. I think we need to trust communities more, especially agencies need to trust. There's a whole aspect about trust. There's a whole question of transparency, and if we knew who owned it and how they owned it, it might be an injection of enthusiasm about doing something about it. And I think your point, a collaboration of organisations who are involved in this and interested in this, I think is essential across the whole nation. And I hope that this will help to accelerate that and make that more important. So just to finish, just obviously a few thanks. We always thank the funders first. So the Heritage Lottery, the Scottish Government for assisting Community Land Scotland, the Esme Fairbairn Foundation who assisted us a lot, and the Tudor Trust. They were all contributed towards the 100 years of community ownership actions and activities like this. Thank you to our panel speakers from across the three nations for sharing their experience and for all the work they do day to day, and to Chris for his inspiring conclusion and bringing the culture element into our thinking. So if you please thank these in the normal way. Finally, I'd like to thank my colleagues in Community Land Scotland, Josh and Ian and Lindsay, and another in a minute, who have put a lot of work into bringing this together. Gavin, the man with the headphones and with all the electronics, has done this on several of our occasions. It's his last day working for us, and not because of this. Let me stress. He's got a new job and he's moving on, and we wish him well in the rest of his career. Thank you very much. Obviously, thank you to the Nationwide Foundation for hosting this and for providing some extra entertainment outside in a second. Thank you for all of you coming and spending time and sharing time with us to take this forward, and for all of those who are out. I keep on pointing. I don't know where I'm pointing. Out in the internet world. Finally, I think, on behalf of you all, just to thank communities large and small across the UK who are all actively working in an increasingly troubled and turbulent world, working hard to make their places better. Thank you all very much for coming. Please make use of the hospitality which has generously been provided by Nationwide.
I am assuming